All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last presentation in the Rodgers Tavern Museum Spring Lecture Series. My name is Jennifer Pitts. I'm an independent museum consultant working with the town of Perryville at the Rodgers Tavern Museum. The RTM is situated along the banks of the beautiful Susquehanna River in Perryville, Maryland. We're located about 43 miles from Baltimore City and 34 miles from Wilmington, Delaware. The Susquehanna Lower Ferry and an ordinary or tavern was formally established by the Maryland colonial government in 1695 on both sides of the Susquehanna River because of its location on a major overland transportation route connecting the eastern and southern colonial capitals and seaports. The building that became known as Rodgers Tavern was built in 1772 and provided a place for travelers to rest and eat and for locals to conduct business, catch up on the news of the day, and enjoy drinking with coworkers and friends until sometime in the 1880s, when it ceased operation as a tavern/hotel/summer boarding establishment and was converted into a duplex housing unit. Rodgers Tavern was saved from demolition by the organization now known as Preservation Maryland in 1954. The Friends of Rodgers Tavern subsequently formed to renovate the building with the goal to return it to its 18th century appearance. Placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972, it was purchased by the town of Perryville in 1993. The mission of the Rodgers Tavern Museum is to preserve and share the imitable stories of all who lived, worked at, and visited this vital link along an important roadway in America's early history through dynamic, engaging experiences that encourage exploration of our area's rich cultural and natural legacy. All lectures are recorded and will be made available to the public on the Rodgers Tavern Museum website and on YouTube. Please enter your questions in the chat or the Q&A box. We'll get to them at the end of the lecture. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jenny Masur, a native Washingtonian. Jenny worked for 17 years for the National Park Service as National Capital Region Manager for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Her respect for the heroes of the Underground Railroad continues to grow. She's the author of Maryland Freedom Seekers on the Underground Railroad and Heroes of the Underground Railroad around Washington, D.C. Thank you, Jenny. Welcome, and take it from here. I am going to go ahead and give you control of the presentation, and you can share your screen and we can get into the presentation.
Okay, let's see. I welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I have been doing research on Underground Railroad for about 20 years or so. And Cecil County is somewhat new to me, except that there are a couple of sites on the Network to Freedom now. And those are interesting to look at if you can get a copy of the write-ups for the applications to the Network to Freedom, and you can see who prepared them. That's a good starting point. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to mention why is this called freedom seekers? It's a term that some people prefer to fugitive slave or runaway slave or other such terms because they feel it shows more respect. It shows that they were not permanently slaves. It wasn't a permanent condition. It was a temporary condition that could be removed. And my feeling is you should use respectful terms when you're dealing with people so that it's not political correctness, it's respect. So moving on from there, I don't know whether historians really have ethics, but I made some up. I think these are all important things to keep in mind when you're doing the research. First of all, you have to show tact. As I just said, you have to use respectful terminology. If somebody says to you, I don't like the term slave, then you could say, what would you prefer? And if they say enslaved, then you should start using that. And it's a little more unwieldy, but it will make people much happier. And it'll show that you're really serious about dealing with them. avoid assumptions about what a historian has a right to know or have, because the material is out there for everybody. But if somebody has the material themselves, they don't have to give it to you. And they don't have to tell you exactly what they have, even if they don't give it to you. That's something, a relationship that you have to build up. And you should be mindful of that, just as it would be in anything else. You should avoid assumptions about people, what they might or might not know, what their families might or might not have done, and what you expect you're going to find, because sometimes there are very big surprises. You should also not assume that the subjects you are going to be studying are ignorant or just something or other, because they had talents that we don't have today in the 21st century. You know, they could go out and hunt, they could go out and fish, they could find their way in the woods at night, they could and especially the enslaved people knew how to put on a front. So in order to please the people who owned them, they might act in a certain way, which might not reflect how they would act naturally. And so often you'll see on a runaway ad or somewhere else, the person saying, I don't know why they left, they were perfectly happy. Well, if they were perfectly happy, why did they leave? So that's one case where you can't take what is said for granted. You have to look at who's saying it and why they're saying it and under what conditions, and think about what the other person might have been thinking on their part. And so I put on one of the tips that I think is posted on the website, think like a 19th century person. Try to remember that your values are not necessarily the values of the people that you're going to study, that what they knew and you know are very different, and how they dealt with people was very different, and the society was very different. You should respect what people consider to be ownership. If they have family records, if they have family oral tradition, if it's a church's history, they may feel that they can tell you yes or no, you have access to it, and you need to respect that, because just if you had family records, you might not turn them over to anybody who came and knocked on the door. You should show appreciation for any assistance anybody gives you, and that could be verbal, in writing, thank you letter, it could be any number of things. But I worked with some people in Baltimore County who one of the local historians, and somebody worked for the zoning department of the county, and they helped a lot of people, and they said they never heard from those people again. Well, that is a big faux pas. Okay, acknowledgement, again, is the same thing. You give people recognition for the assistance, or respect their anonymity. If they say, I'll give you the information, but I don't want you to know where it came from, then you have to kind of work around that. You either find another way to confirm what they said, or you have to say something that's passive, it is said, or whatever. Or there's more to be found out about this, and it may, but you don't want to speculate either. And that applies to everybody you network with, that you should respect their assistance, and whether they say they want to be identified or not. You should document what you find, keep track of your sources. And I'm saying that after I wrote 2 books that don't have footnotes, but that was because of the number of words the publisher permitted, and I actually have 500 footnotes for the Maryland Freedom Seekers that I have in my records that I've shared with people. What you find is not something that you own. If somebody gives you permission, and they allow it, I think that you should publish it or lecture or deposit with the local historic society. You should share it with other people that you network with, because it's not a private undertaking. Sometimes people can get very jealous of what they found. And I find that that's not very useful, because often other people have information that you want, and it's quid pro quo. So with that, these are people that at some point you might want to contact, or you might want to find out more about. The Maryland State Archives, Chris Haley works with something called the Legacy of Slavery in Maryland. That you're going to see the website on the next slide, and that's something that's very important to look into. He works for a public institution, so you can contact him or somebody who's working with him. And Mike Dixon is somebody who gives lectures, walking tours, has written articles and so forth. So you should start with what he's already made public. And at some point, maybe he'll come to speak for the Rodgers Tavern or for the Historical Society, and you can get a chance to hear what he has to say. On the Baltimore City Archives, there's something called Tuesdays with Ed. That's Dr. Ed Pappenfuss, who was the archivist of Maryland. And as you can imagine, he knows an awful lot about Maryland history. And if he's sometimes so kind as to let you arrange an appointment by Zoom with him, and he will help you with research strategy. I'm not sure how he'll feel if 45 people from Cecil County individually contact him, but you can try. And then Milt Diggins, you probably know his book, Stealing Freedom Along the Mason-Dixon Line. I'm sure he's still doing research. So he's another person to keep your eye out for and to look for things he's published. Okay, now these are some things, places that you want to contact. Cecil County, as you all know, borders with Delaware and Pennsylvania. Well, in Delaware, there's a State Historic Preservation Office, and that's a good place to look at the website or contact, because they will have a lot of information on the Underground Railroad, and the Underground Railroad is widely defined as people escaping to freedom, not just organized networks. You might want to contact the State Law Library, because if nothing else, they have databases, legal databases, and court cases are a very good source of information. People had to testify, and things had to be sworn to and so forth. So whether they're telling the truth or not, there's some kind of starting point there. I don't know if there's a Maryland room in Cecil County, but a lot of the other counties in Maryland have one. And in the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore, there's a Maryland department. And it's a great, as it says here, I won't read it to you, but it's a great place to start. If you're interested in somebody going from Cecil County, let's say they go down through one of the counties that borders on Delaware further south before they head north, then you might want to contact the Maryland room in the county that they go through as a starting point, as well as the Historical Society. Quakers are often mentioned as being involved with the Underground Railroad. They were anti-slavery. They were not necessarily abolitionists. Some of them did not believe in breaking the law, but the history of the Quaker meeting, that people buried in the cemetery, it's very important. Sometimes they were busy helping the African Americans if they could. You remember Maryland was a slave state, so it was a little bit risky. So that's one thing you might want to look into, the history of the Quaker meetings in the county. and if there are any records left over. Also, Swarthmore College has a collection of documents related to societies of friends, which is what Quaker meetings are called, and that's another good place to contact. I don't know if any of you have been to the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. They have a very good Underground Railroad exhibit right now. And remember, you have a railroad running through the county, I believe. And it's an early railroad. So there would have been people using the tracks or the railroad to escape, very likely after the railroad was established. So that's another thing to look into. Websites. There's the first one on the left is Documenting the American South. That is University of North Carolina has tried to collect Southern memoirs and Southern accounts. And there's one that is slave narratives. Slave narratives are what accounts that were written by people who had been enslaved and became free. And they were usually written with the help of abolitionists with a certain purpose. And often the person who helped them write it was religious. The person who is the subject may have been very religious also, but you have to be aware of biases that might be introduced. They're very valuable, but I do warn you, there's one by James Williams, which I wanted to include in my book, and I did my very best to verify or confirm some of what he says, and I was not able to. He was one of these people, kind of like Waldo, who seemed to have been everywhere doing everything related to the Underground Railroad, which immediately raises a question mark to me. People usually don't do everything. Okay, Chronicling America. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. That's the Library of Congress website, which is newspapers from all over the country. And remember, you want to start with Cecil County newspapers and with the Baltimore Sun and possibly major newspapers, say in Philadelphia or New York and Boston. But you have to remember that the counties that border on Cecil County and the counties in Pennsylvania may have very important information. The counties in Delaware may have very important information. You may need to look at the newspapers that are published in those places for the dates you're interested in. And a very, very important website, that's why it's in the middle, is The Legacy of Slavery in Maryland. I mentioned Chris Haley in relationship with that. That is a starting point. They had money for a number of years to do county by county. They didn't finish the job because they ran out of money. But they have what they call case studies, which are profiles of people that they researched for Cecil County. The list of people that they have who had escaped are all from William Still's book. And William Still is on the bibliography. He wrote a book after the Civil War, which is his notes from being one of the activists in Philadelphia who vetted the people coming through to make sure that they were legitimate. Sometimes people would pose as escaping people in order to get the information and then turn the people who are helping them in. So his notes were invaluable. The book was published. A lot of it has been confirmed. It's a very good source. And there are also, what part of his journal survived, and there are some details in the journal that are not in the book. So the other thing you want to look at for sure is the database. The database, they've collected runaway ads, they've collected manumission records, they've collected jail records, and you may have to look under various headings because Cecil County won't do it necessarily. You're going to get people named Cecil. You're going to get, but you have to be creative in the terms you use to look. And if you know that Jane Doe escaped, it never hurts to try Jane Doe and see if there's somebody with that name who came from Cecil County. So if you're lucky, you'll find the runaway ad, and that gives you information in and of itself. I'm sure most of you have seen a runaway ad and you know what it includes. It includes physical description, possibly the occupation, possibly the way that the person who wrote the ad thought the person was headed, and their manner of escape. So that's all very important. Accessible Archives, despite its name, it's African American newspapers from the 19th century. And that's a very good source that you can get from the Enoch Pratt library, going through the library card. They have databases, and you can get it if you go to the Library of Congress or somewhere else. I don't know whether the Cecil County Library has that, but that's a very good source. It includes Frederick Douglass's newspaper and other such sources, and sometimes you strike it rich and you get a very good article on somebody. The Baltimore Sun, you're all familiar with. Well, the Baltimore Sun was kind of the paper of record. It goes back to 1837, and it's searchable. And again, if you have access to the database, you can search that. Sometimes things show up in the New York Times, but remember, New York was not Maryland. So that would be a piece of luck or a fact that the person ended up in New York and was caught in New York. That brings up another issue, which is if you're tracking someone who's escaping, you have to remember that there's a starting point in Cecil County, and that's where you're going to have the best luck because you have access to the sources better than almost anybody else. But once they left Cecil County, where did they go? They may have gone to Chester County. Then you would have to look at Chester County sources. They may have gone to Philadelphia. You might have to look at Philadelphia sources. There was something after the 1830s called the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. That was a committee that helped people who were escaping. They may have kept some records. And the people who were on the committee are worth investigating, and I'll get to that in a minute. The next thing, there's some maps and things on this too, so it wouldn't hurt to go through every one of the things at the top just to see what there is. I'm going back to the legacy of slavery. I'm kind of jumping. Okay, let's keep going. These are some of what I consider very important sources. I already mentioned Underground Railroad, Googling Cecil County fugitive slave. This is one thing from Still that I came up with without having to look. Robert Johns and his wife, Sue Ann, 1858. You might be able to find a runaway ad for them. I looked on Legacy of Slavery and didn't find it, but that doesn't mean that you might not find it somewhere else. You might have access to the Cecil Whig. You might have, I don't know if there are any other local newspapers. I don't know about the newspapers in Delaware and Wilmington or the other nearer large towns or cities. There's a book by someone named Helen Catterall. She compiled cases concerning slavery and the Negro. You can tell when this was written by how she wrote the title. It's worth looking in there at the Maryland cases to see if any of them seem to have anything to do with Cecil County. Sometimes you have to know the names of the people, and I don't know the county history, so I wouldn't recognize, say, what the biggest slave owner in the county, but you might. And if there was a case concerning that person, that would be something you would want to pursue. There's somebody named Wilbert Siebert. He's another major source like William Still. He was a white professor at Ohio State. He did years and years of research on what he considered to be the Underground Railroad. He sent around questionnaires to people in different places, and they would write back and say, my father did X, Y, and Z. I remember Mr. Jones always helped people. And if nothing else, that's a starting point. So that's worth pursuing. And he published a couple of books. So again, you might be able to find the books. And then there are things like this. If the Library of Congress has slaves in the courts, well, there were pamphlets written about some of the famous cases. So if it turns out you've got a famous case, you may find that there's a pamphlet that tells you a lot of what you need to know, so it would save you a lot of trouble. Okay, this is some helpful hints here. I would emphasize that having access to a period newspaper map rather or a modern map is very important to see where things are in relationship to each other and to see what's near the water. There's a lot of transportation by water, and a lot of the people who are enslaved may have been watermen, and the free Blacks or the other enslaved people sometimes help people who are escaping at their own risk. And so you need to be aware of that. People did not necessarily just tromp through the cornfields to get to freedom. They were very ingenious and they tried all kinds of things. You probably know the story of Henry Box Brown, who mailed himself in a box from Richmond, Virginia. There was a woman named Leah Green who did that from Baltimore, Maryland. And so people came up with all kinds of things. Okay, I don't know if you're all familiar with the National Register of Historic Places. Those are places that are documented to be still in historically accurate condition. And to get onto the register, you have to write an application that has the history and the architecture of the site. And if you can look at the ones from Cecil County, that may be a starting point for finding plantations. So that's something you want to look at. Maryland Historical Trust, some of the things on the Historical Trust are not on the National Register. Again, there are write-ups of applications that have background information. Depending on when the write-ups were done, sometimes they paid no attention to the enslaved people. That was not what they were interested in at the time. I came across this about a garden tour of Cecil County. I think that they did one this year too, and there may be some private homes that are on the tour, which are not normally open to the public and may still be in the hands of the people whose family had them for the last 100 or 200 years. So or the current owners may have access to some of the family papers. So that's something that's very important as a clue to what to look out for. Okay, now how are you going to find the freedom seekers? Okay, one way is to look at the U.S. colored troops who enlisted in Cecil County or who enlisted in the nearest place to Cecil County. They had to say where the person came from. I don't know if you're familiar with Fold 3. It's on Ancestry, but you can also get it, I think, directly on the web. And you can look into people's records and you can see where they were born. They may not tell you anything except that they were born in Cecil County. They may or may not say whether they were enslaved when they joined the Army. But the U.S. colored troops had a lot of people who were fleeing slavery, seeking freedom, male, naturally. And this was something apparently Edward Richardson has been researched. He's on the web. You can Google him. And interestingly enough, he went to New Jersey. So you have to think about where people might have gone. It sounds like in Salem, New Jersey, there may have been a community of people from Cecil County. So that's something you want to check into. Sometimes you can find obituaries in the local paper. Sometimes you can find things mentioned in newspaper articles. The next thing is the Cecil County Jail. They have records of people who were jailed there. Some of them would have been people who ran from Cecil County. Some of them would have been people who were running from somewhere else who were caught in Cecil County. And depending on how you're defining what you're looking for, that could be very useful. Some of the records will be on the legacy of slavery in Maryland. But I don't know if the jail still stands. I don't know if there are any independent records. The courthouse, I don't know where the courthouse's records are right now, if they all went to the Maryland State Archives or if some of them are still in the courthouse from before the Civil War. But legal records are very important. For one thing, you've got the wills of the people who were slave owners. And that means that when they died, they took an inventory of their possessions. Well, of course, the enslaved people were some of their possessions. So you can see what's outlined here in red are some of the people and how much they were worth. Well, if you're looking for somebody and you want to know who they belong to in what, for sure, that's one way to check it, to go back and look on the inventory, if there was an inventory, but it's worth searching for. And then we have, I saw this online, and apparently the Historical Society of Cecil County had a project to preserve records. So that would be something to find out about that were digitized. I don't know how recent that is, and I don't know what that includes, but it's certainly worth looking into. Okay, how am I doing for time? I guess I've got, I was going to talk about some case studies, but let me, before I get to that, I had some tips I wanted to mention to you that I have. Some of them I've already mentioned, but if you don't have a Maryland Library card, be sure to get one and use the Enoch Pratt Library website. I'm going to repeat that because the databases under the research heading are very useful, especially the newspaper databases, but you can explore the databases and who knows what you're going to find. Keep a log of the search tactics you've tried and what you found or haven't found. What you haven't found is just as important as what you have found, because for one thing, then you won't go back and look again. And for another thing, let's say you'll find out there are no jail records. So that's something you need to remember. Use serendipity when chatting with other researchers. You might run into somebody at the Maryland State Archives. You might run into somebody at the coffee shop near the Maryland State Archives. I don't know if there is one, but or near the courthouse. And you may say, I'm interested in Sue Johns, and it happened to me once in Chestertown. I was talking to one of the professors there. We were having a light conversation. I was talking about somebody I was interested in. And this man came over and stood and said, "You said Isaac Mason? Did you say Isaac Mason?" Well, he knew a lot about Isaac Mason. He was the head of the humanities organization in the county. And he happened to have an affinity for Isaac Mason. And he was collecting research. He had a painting commissioned, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's serendipity. I wouldn't have known that unless somebody told me that or the person presented themselves to me. So you never know what you're going to come up with when you're talking to someone, or they may tell you something that you might as well not look into. They may say, "Oh, I've already looked into the prison records and I couldn't find them." You might still want to look, but at least you should note that down to know that somebody else hasn't had luck. Don't believe everything you see in print or in records. Just because it's in the court records, that's a source, but if you can cross-check it, that's better. If it's in a book, Not all books are equal. Some of the books are much better researched than others. And if they're footnotes and it looks like the person who wrote the book has credentials, then that's a good place to start to look in the index. You may have to look under Maryland and look up every person who's listed as being from Maryland to see whether any of them are from Cecil County, because they may not list Cecil County. And they may or may not have people listed as so-called fugitive slaves. So you have to be creative in looking in the index, but that's a good source. Somebody's already done the research for you. And it may turn out that the person was an important case in the 19th century that's we don't keep track of. It's always good to try and get sources that cross-check each other. And the other thing I would add as a tip is make a chronology of important events so that you have context for what you're researching. Because, for example, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was very important, but some of the Supreme Court decisions of the time were also important, and those had an impact. Some of the Black Code laws, I don't know what there was in Cecil County, were important. There were curfews in some places. Look into transportation routes. There are a lot of things you want to look at, because if somebody could take a ferry, they might be able to smuggle themselves on the ferry. The ferryman might be sympathetic and they might be able to go across. And the Susquehanna borders on Pennsylvania, and any of the border towns are important. Things happened in the border towns, and you want to be aware of the newspapers from the border towns and some of the incidents. And some of the incidents that were important then are not important to us anymore. Now, I'm going to go into this one case study. Unfortunately, part of the case study is there. It's not covered up, but now can you see it all, or did we get out of the, can you see the whole screen?
Yes, I can see your entire screen.
Okay. This is an example of something that is not billed as the escape of an enslaved person. It was billed as a riot, and it was called the McClintock Riot, which was named after a white abolitionist professor at Dickinson College. Dickinson, the town of Dickinson, of Carlisle, was not, just because it was in Pennsylvania, it had a lot of Southerners. It was not necessarily sympathetic to people who were fleeing slavery. So I looked at that and then I said, well, wait a minute. The important thing to me is not McClintock. The important thing to me is who were the people that they were rioting, quote unquote, about, who had escaped. And so I wanted to find out as much as I could about those people. And they came from Hagerstown. And so that was one of the chapters in my book. I went back and I went to Hagerstown, to the Historical Society and the library, and I was able to find out something about the person who owned them and about what the occupation was and so forth. So that was very useful. And then I looked at the newspapers on both sides of the border. I looked at the Baltimore Sun and the Pennsylvania papers, the Dickinson College archives, because remember, it was in Dickinson College existed at that point. The lives of the owners, and so I went to the, like I said, the historical, and I tried to look into the small Black community, and I found an unpublished manuscript and then a personal communication with a couple people who are doing research. And I got information on the Black community. It turned out that one of the women who was fleeing had a free husband, and he was involved in trying to free her when she was fleeing through town and had been caught and was being taken to the courthouse to be examined under the Fugitive Slave Act. And he was trying to get her free before she was sent back to Maryland. And he was sent to penitentiary for his activities. He was not successful. She did escape, but not through his efforts. And but it turned out I followed up to the penitentiary, and lo and behold, there were records kept in the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Not a lot of records, but there was something more about him than I knew otherwise. So you want to keep an eye on all the leads, and you want to look for the names of the people who are mentioned. Who was the lawyer? Was the lawyer somebody who was well known? You'll find some of the people who are in Philadelphia or New York or Boston from Cecil County are being defended by an abolitionist lawyer. Well, usually those people were pretty well known. And you might find something in accounts about them or in records about them that's useful. So you want to follow up on that. Now, can we get into the bibliography?
Yes, so there are some documents, PDFs that Jenny has graciously shared with us. I will be posting those into the chat as soon as Jenny is done with the very informative lecture that she's been given, and we'll move on to questions when you're ready.
Oh, you can't show the bibliography?
I'll need to take the screen back from
All right, then
you.
we'll just go to questions. That's fine.
So,
I did do a bibliography, and it's going to be posted on the website.
okay. So if you'll give me just a moment, Jenny, I can go ahead and pull that bibliography up if you wanted to just go through it.
I see there's some questions. I could do a question or two while you're doing that. Should I do that?
Hang on just a second. Okay, so this is the bibliography.
Okay. One very good source is Blackett, The Captain's Quest for Freedom. He looked at some of the regional areas where people were escaping, and that covers parts of Maryland. So you should definitely look at that and look at the indices, the index, and see what you can find that's related to the county, if you can find anything. Bancroft was somebody who, it was not written in 1966. That's when the edition was published. He wrote about slave trading in the Old South. Well, one reason people ran away was they were going to be sold south. And so you need to know something about slave trading. John Blassingame wrote an enormous volume that has letters, speeches, interviews, as it says in the title. It's worth looking in the index in that, maybe under Maryland, maybe under whatever you could find. And of course, you may get sidetracked because some of it is so interesting. Stanley Campbell, The Slave Catchers. Well, that's important because it's the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law from 1850 to 1860. There was a Fugitive Slave Act from 1790, now I can't remember, it's 1794 or 1796, but the one in 1850 was much more rigorous. And so when that was passed, there was a big to-do, and people continued to try to escape. But if they were caught, there were, it often got in the news, especially right after the bill was passed. Andrew Delbanco also is writing about the struggle right before the civil, well, not right before from the Revolution to the Civil War. It's worth looking in his book and looking in the index. We've got Milt Diggins because he's got the cases of Thomas McCreary. And since he was from Cecil County, he certainly might have been employed by people in Cecil County to go and bring back some of the people who had escaped. Benjamin Drew was in Canada. He was interviewing people in Canada, and some of them were Marylanders. There may be somebody from Cecil County. It's worth looking. I don't know how far back in time you're going to go. You may go back to the Revolution. If you're going back to the Revolution and right after the Revolution, and you want to look at somebody who's done research on the Revolution, you all probably want to look at Barbara Jean Fields' Slavery and Freedom and Middle Ground. So I won't go through the rest of it, but Paul Finkelman did a lot of research on slavery and the law. So looking at, he did a multi-volume book. He did articles. He did, I don't know if the books are still available because a lot of things are on digitized, but if you can find them, it's worth looking through to see what's in there. Let's see what else. We're only at F. I don't know if we have time to go through the rest of it. That gives you an idea anyway. I've lost you. You're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. I apologize. So we have a question. Do you have any knowledge of the Cumberland, Maryland Railroad operating through the tunnels of the Episcopal Church there?
Okay, well, it's on the Maryland State Archives website, but I consider it, I'm pretty rigorous about what is confirmed and what is not confirmed, and it's oral tradition. So I am not going to go either way on that. But you might want to look and see what they have on the legacy of slavery and freedom. You might want to go up there and talk to somebody. And you would want to find out more about the church.
Okay, we have a comment in the chat. Tremendous amount of information. This is wonderful. Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with that, but I'm slightly biased. All right, so everyone, what I'm going to do, well, if there are any more questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A or the chat. But I'm going to start posting in the chat some of the documents that Jenny has agreed to share with us. And that includes the bibliography that you just saw. That's a 3-pager. And then the next document that you shared with us were the research tips. So I'm posting that as well. And then there was also another document. This is Fugitive Slave Records, 1820 to 1839. Could you talk about that one for just a little bit, please, Jenny?
Sure. I thought I had Googled Cecil County and escaped, freedom seekers, and I apparently had not used the right word, or more had been posted since I Googled it. I found about 8 or 10 references that could be pursued. And one of them was some records from Chester County, Pennsylvania, listing the people who, I guess, came through. You do have to find out what the record really refers to, but it gives the county of the person, and that would be a starting point. Can you trace the person back to Cecil County? And then can you find out anything more about what happened to them when they were in Chester County and what happened to them after Chester County? So that's a case of checking the records in a neighboring county on the other side of the border.
That's a very good point about checking records and resources in neighboring counties as well as neighboring states. Okay, let's see. Do we have any other questions? Any other comments? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for agreeing to give this talk tonight. It has been very informative. You've been very generous with your time and the resources, and I apologize, everyone. I'm not sure why you're not able to see the documents that I've uploaded into the chat. On my end, it says that they went and I can see them. Okay. Maybe they're just not showing up. But what I will do is when this lecture is uploaded to the museum's website, I will find a way to make these documents available on the Rodgers Tavern Museum website as well. And of course, you can always contact the museum, and I'll be happy to send anyone who would like a copy direct to them. That is not a problem whatsoever. Well, Jenny, again, thank you. This has been so much fun and so informative. You've been a wonderful speaker. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us tonight. And if anyone has any questions, is there a preferred method to get in contact with you?
Email.
Okay.
I did not
could you
post
provide your
my email on one of the slides, but you feel free to give it out. And I want to wish you all luck, happy hunting, and remember, share the information that you find.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you, everyone, for joining us in this last lecture in the Rodgers Tavern Museum Spring Lecture Series. We will see you next year with a whole new slate of speakers. Thank you and good night, everyone.